One of the hardest things to do when you're creating an illustration is simply to figure out what color to pick. How do you actually figure out what color goes where? And even in your mind, you might have a good idea of what the color should be, but in Photoshop, how do you actually pick it? And how do you know it's going to fit? In this video, which is actually part 4 of a multi-part tutorial series, I'm going to look at how to create the finished colors for a cover quality illustration. This is where we're trying to get something that is high quality, has a high level of polish. And so much of what choosing colors comes down to is, again, sticking to our overall color scheme. We had a good color thumbnail that we created in part 1 of this series. Here we get to apply it, and so much of this is looking at subtlety. How do we create some complexity to those simple colors? It's also important to understand that you often have a color scheme or an idea in mind, but we still need to feel creative. It's important to be able to push the boundaries, to experiment. And even if you've got a thumbnail that has a very sort of good color scheme, it's important to know when you can deviate from that, when you can play around, and when you can have fun. Ultimately, I think color, especially with the line and color style, is about experimenting with the way that the color affects us. How does it alter our emotions, and how does it make us feel? As usual for a drawing codex video, this is not going to be fast-paced or heavily edited. This is a real-time, fully narrated tutorial. You can hang out with me, and I'm going to show you how I create this illustration basically from start to finish. And in this video, we're looking specifically at how we color it. And I'm just going to talk you through how I'm choosing these particular colors, the process that I'm using, and especially how we take that thumbnail idea and make it into something that is a little bit more special. So again, think of this more like a drawing lesson. Hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about line and color illustration, you can check out my free quick start guide. It's aimed to get you up and running quickly in Photoshop, developing your own simple, reliable line and color process and style. You'll get access to all of the brushes and Photoshop documents and tricks and tips that I use as I create the illustration in this guide. It's free. The link will be in the description, so go check that out if that's something you're interested in. Okay, let's begin the coloring process. Now, what I'm going to share with you as part of, I guess, the beginning of this is some of the tricks that I use for slightly more efficient flatting in Photoshop. But before that, again, let's just recap and look at kind of where we have been. So we started off with a thumbnail, although this thumbnail was done very, very large version of this kind of cover. And what we did is then explored a variety of different ways that this could be colored, and looking at different sort of color schemes and ways we could use simple color planning, simple color method to do this, and ended up choosing this one. So the next phase was the construction phase, and this is where we took the general idea here but trued it up a little bit. Now this construction phase would be much more detailed if you are coming at this from a rougher sketch, right? If this sketch is a lot rougher, it's a lot smaller, you probably need to do a little bit more work in the construction phase. And that's just one of those things that you improve at over time, is your initial blocking, your initial thumbnails, your initial sketches get a little bit better. So you have to, do less kind of redrawing. But still, we needed to really sort of true that up and get that kind of solid. And then we did our finished lines. And one of the major things that we doing here is just thinking about layers, right? Like, how many layers do we have? And in this instance, we got quite a few. I've got, right, essentially we got one foreground layer for these things, another foreground layer for that stuff, got another foreground layer here. Then we got the character, and we had the second bit of the character here. At this point, we can probably merge those. And then we've got this other stuff, which is part of the foreground. And then we got this, which is also also kind of a little bit closer to her. And then we got this stuff in the background and then this stuff in the background. Now, again, it's interesting the way this will kind of work. And one of the things I kind of notice is probably what I should do is, look at, maybe putting some, right, like a few little bits and pieces in here. Right, just to kind of round this out. And potentially, we should look at, maybe let's get rid of this. And these are the things that are always worth doing, right? Just go through. Right, this will mean that if I ever do take away the text there, that at least there'll be something there. So I'm being a little bit rough with it. Let's see if we can be a bit more deliberate. Fill this up a bit, and then here with this, let's see if we can. Right, be a little bit more detailed. And this will just mean that, if I do take away this text at some point, it's not going to look like a complete travesty, which it sort of does at the moment. Either way, all this stuff is going to be pushed pretty far back. So what do? I've got all these different layers here. And this is also another one of those things that I often talk about is before you start the process of any sort of stage, right? Going from thumbnails to construction to lines, just do a check. So it's always good to, take away your construction drawing, take away everything else, right? Like, so, this would be how I kind of ended up inking it, with a faint sort of version of the previous stages underneath. Let's just take that away. Let's step back. Let's look at what I've got. Let's step through these layers one at a time. Make sure I don't have any weird little bits and pieces stuck in the middle of nowhere. And this often can happen. Very easy to accidentally get something on the wrong layer. We kind of messed up. And that can, take a lot of time to sort of fix later on. So, just make sure everything's there. Clean a few bits up if you need. But again, I got all these layers. How do we deal with this? Well, let's get rid of our bleed marks and our text for this kind of faux cover that we've been working on. And what I'll do is I'll step you through the process for how I would do it. And turn on contiguous. And often we get quite a few questions at this stage for, how am I doing this? What's going on? What are you doing? And so then what I'll do is kind of show you what is happening here. And being able to break this video up into a few parts, right? Normally I do these big tutorials as like one chunky, gigantic, sort of 4-hour video. Breaking it up like this allows me to go into depth a little bit more with some of this sort of technical stuff. So here I'm going to go into Quick Mask. And all I'm doing is now that I have this selection in Quick Mask, I've got my pencil tool. My pencil tool means that there is, the lines are aliased, right? If we sort of zoom out, right? These are just pixel on pixel lines, right? There's no softness on the edges. It's just flat. Now, why is this important? Well, because when we're actually going through and filling lines, often what we're trying to do is kind of close these gaps. And what I want is just a flat selection initially. Now, the reason for this is that this is kind of the history of how comic book flatting and coloring kind of was done, just very simply without a lot of gradients, so no sort of brushiness, just a matter of sort of simple colors. But also this does allow me to make some very sort of effective selections. But this is not what we're going to sort of end up with. This just starts the process, and it allows me to make sure I have a very sort of clean set of lines here. And I just essentially am working with the magic wand tool when we're out of quick mask to, select things. And what I'm doing is I'm selecting what is not the object that I'm going to isolate and create flats for. So whatever I'm trying to create a flat for, right, flat series of colors, that's not what I'm clicking on. I'm clicking on the white space around it. And then I go into quick mask and I'm basically refining that selection with the pencil tool. So when we're in magic wand, I've got tolerance set to 10. You could be, again, you need to know how the tolerance settings work. Anti-aliasing is off, contiguous is on, and I've got sample all layers. So this basically, when I sort of hide when I sort of, only have the layer that's visible there, I can basically just select everything else and I create this little mask of it. And then I run an action, right? And I think I'm going to press the right action because I always sort of forget. Boom. And that is sort of the right action. Right. So what has this done? This has basically automatically created a nice set of flats. And I'm actually going to start these off by creating them, boom, and making them very sort of similar to the kind of color tonality we have. Now, something that's interesting here, though, if you actually look closely, that there's a bit more going on to the way this particular system that I'm using sort of functions. And again, there's a lot of different ways you can wrangle this within Photoshop. Now, I know that Procreate has a lot of tools where it handles a lot of the selections where you can essentially just drag colors onto particular areas and it kind of does magic, right? Has some sort of smart machine learning style algorithms there that kind of figure out what you're dropping the color onto and kind of does that. None of this is perfect though. I mean, if you're working vector, then maybe you're going to be able to drop these flats on, but you're always dealing with some machine having to figure out what you're dropping onto and how it's going to change that, and there's often artifacting. What you have here is quite a sort of clean sort of look that's very, very specific to the process that I like to use. And what it means is I essentially end up with these two layers and I can move these around. And it becomes a lot easier to do things like animation with this particular type of style. Often if you're using this type of line and color style and you have like colored lines and sort of trickiness, I'll just sort of do a few more while I'm sort of working. And then I'll kind of show you how that is working. But there's different levels of complexity to exactly what's happening. Often when you're working and people are going to request things like, we want to have everything on separate layers so that we can animate it. This is often something that gets requested frequently if you're working in illustration. Often if you're working on a trading card these days, those trading cards are animated. Everything is kind of animated, often via a different motion designer who's going to take your work and sort of create subtle animations or VFX. I'm just going to select that with the magic wand. I'm going to press delete. I'm in quick mask now, right? And I'm essentially just closing these lines, right? So before, you could see I have an open line. So I'm trying to sort of say, look, this is all one log. But if I go G for paint bucket and I click on there, it's escaping, right? It's essentially going, yeah, you want me to click on all this white and it's not sort of bounded. So I'm just sort of closing that. And now when I click on that, it sort of can't escape and it goes and does that. So these are the kind of selections that I'm wanting to get. I'm in quick mask and the action that I have essentially works from quick mask and it goes and creates a whole pile of layers, including an original version of these lines and also a flat version of it. And then, interestingly enough, right, if we kind of look again, like these will kind of float over each other. And the other thing is that often if you sort of flatten down lines that have had this type of effect, it's very tricky to get the line to perfectly match, right? So if you kind of zoom into the pixel level, what we kind of want is to make sure that this line represents the actual line that I drew. And often what happens when you're creating different types of sort of flatting, you can get haloing, you can get all sorts of artifacting, because unless you get this exactly right, it's very tricky. Because what I want to do is make sure that I can actually clip my lines to that sort of flat. So what you see is that the flat is now actually turned in, and the flat actually includes the line. So it's a little bit complicated. We're not going to go quite into that sort of detail with this one, but I'll show you how to basically set up a very sort of simple version of this, and how to make these sort of selections. But again, to do the actions, it's probably something where, again, you really have to kind of understand how Photoshop is working on a pretty deep level, build your own actions. I'll try and make a sort of a, again, like, you know, a video on that sort of one day. But every time I try and make a video looking at how we would sort of get into doing the flatting here, there's so many levels in terms of explaining how the actions work, you know, how to record them. There's a million little things that do and don't work with the actions. You really do need to understand a lot about Photoshop and how it functions. So it's kind of tricky to be like, here's a 15-minute tutorial. It's more like going to be, here's a 1.5-hour tutorial that talks about a bunch of technical stuff that, again, I feel like most people would be super bored by from a YouTube perspective. But I do include all of these concepts in, you know, the sort of courses I have that sort of talk about, you know, specifically how all this kind of works. But this is the effect that I'm sort of getting, is that the flats that we're sort of clipping our lines to are very, very, very closely related to the pixel level to those lines. And this means it's very easy to animate them, clip everything to separate layers, flatten everything down for animation. Super in the weeds, super, you know, boring in most cases, but you know, I think often these are the questions that kind of come up, and people are asking, like, how are you doing that? How, like, that looks like it's going very fast. And yeah, so this is typically what we're doing. I'm clicking on everything that's not. Right, let's put those things above. And now, basically what I'm trying to do is, again, create a nice series of flats. And I'm also trying to sort of, in the background, like, join all these up, because that means that when I add some flat colors to this, it'll all be a lot easier. And this really is a major part of, you know, thinking about the line and color process. Instead of having to recreate masks again and again, instead of having to, you know, mask off certain areas of the work, you basically can create all of the masks in the beginning on separate layers. And this is a fundamental tenet of all digital art, is understanding layer management. And whether you're digital painting, or it doesn't really matter what you're doing, the idea of creating layers that have a mask to them so that you can actually paint on one part of the image without painting on the other is obviously, like, just a major part of all digital art, all painting. And it's one of the major technological challenges that people have with general painting, right? If you're doing, you know, traditional painting, you literally have to paint the mask on with masking fluid. Photoshop is a lot easier, but still there is a technicality to it, right? There is it is pretty boring to kind of learn this stuff and understand how this stuff works. But what you see is, again, if you kind of understand how it works, it's pretty easy to just go through and add all these bits and pieces. And because I've got all these things on layers, again, it seems like it's a lot of fuss in the beginning, but this is what allows me to, you know, get a lot of work done relatively easily. So let's look at what's going on, right? I'm going to hit that action, and it's going to do it all, right? And then bang, that's done. And now I'm just going to be able to quite easily, make these things different colors, and, I'm never going to have to, go in there and sort of paint one thing on top of another or anything like that. I've got them all separated. You can see there is a small little, error here, and this is often the kind of thing that you're trying to avoid. Like I was saying, hey, just make sure you go and check that. It is possible to get these little artifacty mistakes here, right, where I've accidentally drawn over something that I thought was on a different layer. Let's just go and delete from that lines layer that. Boom. All right, so what's going on? Let's look at this from the most basic level. Let's make a little, right, a little test image. Come on, you can save it. You can do it. All right, let's make a new layer. And let's just start with the most basic concept. Let's draw a circle. All right, this is the same. All right, this is the same type of brush that I'm normally using. And let's go through that process. Now, let's just select the white. I've got magic wand. I've got tolerance set to 10. Anti-aliasing is off. Contiguous is on. Sample all layers is on. Boom. Right, let's hit Q for quick mask. I'm going to F for full screen. Right, so you can see that obviously it said, okay, this is closed. It's using selective logic. And that's what the contiguous kind of selection is, where it basically is sort of trying to figure out what is a contained shape and what is a non-contained shape. And what I can do is just close that. And again, I'm closing it with the pencil tool. I get to the pencil tool by going Shift B, right? That'll sort of toggle between the brush and the pencil tool. In modern Photoshop, there's a whole bunch of other brushes that toggles through. I just delete those from the keyboard shortcuts so that we are, just using brush and pencil tool. All right. Now, what we're going to do is essentially, at the most basic level, what you can do, and we'll sort of step through this and look at the basic problem. So if I go out of quick mask, I now have a nice selection. Unfortunately, I'm selecting the wrong thing though, right? So what I need to do is Control Shift I, boom, right? And that just basically inverts that selection. You can go select invert with the menu. Now I'm going to create a new layer underneath that. And, let's just Alt backspace to fill that. And here I have filled with exactly what I selected, which is my jagged set of flats. Now, this is 100% fine. This is kind of all you need. The problem that you'll run into, though, is that you can see I'm starting to get this jaggedness around the edge. So these are the kind of artifacting problems you start to deal with. So let's press question mark to lock the transparency of this flat. And now, again, I get all of the benefits that come with locking transparency, right? I can paint in here and boom, right? Nothing's going anywhere. Now I've got flats, right? So imagine this is a ball or something that I want to flat. Again, it's going to be something complicated like a character, but this gives me the major concept, right? That like I've got, right, background color is one color and this is the other. But the problem is you kind of see there's this little halo, right? Got this little halo of red. And depending on what color, so if the thing that you're, if this is a light color, right, this is where you start to see the problem. If this is a dark color, right, on the background versus a light color on the object, you start to get the halo. And these are the kind of artifacts you get when you're just kind of, dropping or using Procreate's kind of automated feature and you don't dial it in properly. This is just, it kind of getting close, but it's not really doing what we want to do. So there's a number of things you can do, right? Obviously, if you're just to do this by hand, what you would do, right? If you're flatting something that is a lighter color against a darker color, you would probably just try and stay within the lines, and you would naturally sort of do that, right? And it would kind of work. And, you know, I hand flatted an entire, you know, comic book, right? It's perfectly fine if you just go through by hand, right? Flat that, lock it. It's fine. That'll do. It's perfect. Problem is, though, if your lines are a bit light, you can see again, you get this other artifact where I can kind of see through my lines. I can kind of see through them. That's not very good. How do we fix that? Well, again, you could make your lines darker. But, you know, in most cases, you're probably not going to notice this, right? Because, again, this is quite zoomed up, but really this is going to be quite small. So that's not really the problem. One of the reasons that I tend to make my lines a particular tonality, so we'll just sort of look at how we do that. Let's make a white layer under our lines. I'm going to merge the lines onto that white layer. And now I'm going to go image mode. No, what am I going to do? I'm going to do, image adjustments. Again, there's a variety of ways you could do this, but I'm going to go, what am I going to do? Selective color. Boom. There we go. So what I'm going to try and do is look at my sort of neutrals, right? And I'm just going to make them a slight sort of sepia color. Right? Something like that. And then we could also go image, adjustments, selective color. And I could probably select my whites and, right, I could start to make them a little bit yellow. Now, it's probably not going to, you know, it's not really affecting this too much. That's still white, but you can see now I've got like a slightly more sophisticated line. And if I now set that to multiply, what you kind of notice, and this is the number one reason why I tend to color the lines, is now I've got this transparency, but it looks less ugly, essentially. It's not grays there. I'm getting some warmth. And obviously, you could, you know, modify the color of those lines to get, you know, sort of different effects depending on what you want to do. But anyway, it just tends to reduce the grayness. But still, we have a couple of problems. So that's why I normally make the lines a sepia tone. Now, we still have this problem, though, of, right? You know, how do we avoid either this, right, or this? We have to kind of get it just right. So there's a really sort of sensible way that's probably the most effective, and we'll kind of look at that now. So what you can do is I can make this selection, right? I'm going to press Q. Here's my quick mask, and now, you know, I'm gonna close that. Boom. Right. Let's say I'm actually going to make it like a little bit sort of rounded. So I'm in quick mask, and now what I'm going to do is go out of quick mask, and I'm going to go Control Shift I. That's going to invert. But now what I'm going to do, and so let's just go into quick mask, because quick mask essentially just shows you what is selected and what's not. So you can still see I've got that little halo there. That's super annoying, right? But what I can do is select, modify, and I can actually contract by, let's say contract by 1 pixel. And that's actually going to pull it in. So you can see now, like, that's actually pretty good. Now, depending on how big your line is, you're going to want to adjust how many pixels you kind of contract by. But in this case, probably the most sensible thing to do, right, is to let's just contract by another pixel. And let's filter, all right, let's select, modify, and let's feather it. And let's also feather it by like 1 pixel, right? And so you can see what that's actually done is it's sort of softening it, right? So whereas before I had a hard edge, now I've got a soft edge. So let's look at, oh, get out a quick mask. I'm going to make a new, all right, let's get that same color. All right, now if I fill that, right, looks like I've still got a little bit of a halo there, right? So this is where, again, depending on how big your lines are, you may find that, you know, some things do better than others. But what I probably need to do, right, is we probably need to not necessarily feather that, because that, again, is going to give us that kind of really sort of soft feather. Even though we just, right, we did select, modify, right, feather, and it's just like one pixel, right? It still gives us this kind of like pretty serious halo. But again, there are some things you could do here to really kind of make that a little bit better. What you could do is we could actually go into select and mask, or we could actually go into quick mask and we could kind of blur this essentially. So there's a multiple things you could do. I find that select and mask sometimes doesn't work with actions, but yeah, I think we could probably blur. Right, let's do Gaussian blur. Oh, let's go into quick mask, filter, blur, blur, Gaussian blur. Right, and I'm just going to do like point, right, like sort of point 2, point, like half a point sort of pixels, right, something like that. And we'll see if we sort of get something there, right? So you can see, again, like that's a lot closer. We're still getting the haloing, right? But we're like pretty close. And this is where, again, you have to look at the width of your lines, the amount of pixels you need to pull it in or pull it out. This does involve, to a certain degree, standardizing your process, like using a very consistent brush, but that's a big part of what I'm all about is, you know, just sort of treat this as a real sort of system, a way for you to create art, and then focus on the stories and the characters and the things that actually matter. But you can see here, this is kind of essentially sort of what's going on, right? We're creating this kind of halo-y thing, and we're kind of like sucking it in. You could suck it in a little bit more, you could suck it in a little bit less, right? Again, what you find is, you know, if we did kind of suck it in there, and then we go select, modify, right? Let's contract by another, right? By another one, let's really get it in there. Press Q, right? Let's run that blur again. So yeah, Control Alt F will run the same blur action again. Let's do, right? Boom. You can see, right? You can see there, like that's pretty much done it, right? We sort of, you know, got it just in there. And what you can do then is essentially make an action out of that. And the way you do that is to, you know, sort of look at the actions and essentially repeat those steps. Yeah, and then what you find is if I sort of clip this to that, this is where, again, you get like a slightly different sort of look, or you can just leave your lines on top. And yeah, it's just a matter of kind of like fine tuning, playing around with it, but that's what's happening. Or again, if you're not creating comic book pages and, you know, crazy amounts of art all the time, then, you know, you can just do those steps one by one, right? You know, it doesn't actually take that long. And I really recommend probably the thing to do in the beginning is, you know, don't worry too much about the actions. Don't worry too much about speeding it up. Just get used to kind of going through those processes, you know, making the selections, you know, getting it right. And then you'll be able to fine tune it, figure out what works for you. And then maybe later you can kind of record it as an action and kind of figure out how that works. Again, recording actions as a whole, we'd be here for another couple of hours kind of talking about exactly how you would do that. Not because the process is simple, but is sort of messy or like anything's too complicated, but there's so many little things that come up that does involve sort of experimentation. And it just sort of takes a while, right? It just kind of tends to take a bit of time. So anyway, I've taken up longer than I would want to with that, but people always ask me, everyone's always asking me like, what are you doing? What's going on with those actions? I'm normally just kind of speeding through it because again, you know, I just want to get to the fun stuff, which is the coloring. So hopefully that was actually interesting and you haven't sort of tuned out. If you're here after all of that, I do appreciate it. Now let's get on to some fun stuff. Same thing, right? Got my character here and I am, right, so it does help to have these layers on because you can kind of, and I start from the foreground into the background because now I sort of get to see, right, what's crossing over what, and I can close all these gaps, and I'm just going to go through. And you see here, this is something we were talking about when we were doing these lines, like this is going to be more complicated to flat, right, because I've got these vague sort of lines that are kind of not really closed, right? That is fine. And probably, oh, yep. Oh. So then you go hunting and be like, where's it escaping? Where could it possibly be? Where could it possibly be escaping? Ah, here. Should have known. Yeah, so again, that's all pretty much there. So obviously I'll have to separate the colors for, the character inside. I have to flat the difference between the character's skin, all the other sort of elements, but the main character is sort of done. And let's run that action again. And it's done pretty quickly, and that's all over, right? Like bang, there we go. Okay. So yeah, hide that. So there are a couple of other sort of considerations in terms of, the specific action that I'm running and the specific way that it's kind of working. And a lot of that, as I said, is to do with the specific style where I create the sepia lines, and there's a lot of challenges when you do that when it comes to like flattening things for animation. And having it all look kind of perfect. So I kind of got sort of annoyed at that one day and made this kind of really sort of tricky action that actually kind of uses it sort of creates a version of the lines themselves and incorporates that into the flats so that you kind of have this pixel perfect match between the lines and the flats. But it's very sort of geeky Photoshop stuff. Yeah, and again, it would be a lot of technical sort of jargon. All right, fill that. Let's fill that. All right. And you can see here, like, there's a couple of things here where, like, oh, probably, we could probably carve that out, but I'm just going to leave that because the general kind of shape is there. All right. Oh, for some reason there. Oh, that's right. I've got the eyedropper set to current below. Let's do all layers. Boom. There we go. Easy. All right. And yeah, we'll just keep going. Hide that. So this is one of these things that takes quite a while to really kind of dial in. Get into the rhythm of doing it. But this is the reason I still use this in these tutorials is it would add an extra probably hour or half an hour if I was to do these flats a little bit more less automated. And I just know that would be, it's like sort of watching paint dry. It's not terribly fun to do. But I've often said this, that I do recommend you do those flats, by hand in the beginning, because you just get, it's time to chill out. It's actually very good hand-eye coordination. I would always find when I was starting out drawing comics that, flatting the pages in the beginning of the day was a great way to warm up. And this was, there was no way to really automate it with the process I was using at the time. You could pay someone to flat it. That's very common. Most comic book colorists don't flat their own work. But yeah, so I had to do it myself. And, you kind of, because you're kind of constantly like tracing things and trying to, sort of color within the lines, it's actually a really good way to kind of key your hand-eye coordination in the morning. And also, you kind of get to reassess and evaluate the work. And I think there's something valuable in that, being able to contemplate, right? Step back, assess, look at it, get a feel for, what you're going to have to do next, all that kind of fun stuff. Boom, boom, hide that. All right, here. All right, so this is very much a matter of, we kind of just, there are some lines here, but the lines here are not, are not as important as the sort of color and the flats that I'm going to put there. Where is the gap? Which is to say, I kind of have to make up where the flats go here. So yeah, sometimes it can be tricky to figure out like where. Oh, there it is. There it's escaping. All right. So again, the point is that I'm going to have to make up, right, a lot of extra kind of shapes here, but that's fine because all of this stuff is basically just going to be background noise, right? Background pattern. So, all right, so even though it's a bit messy, I'm kind of making it up. That's all okay. Boom, 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 boom. And again, I'm sort of getting caught in the trap of doing way too much. All right. So yeah, and this is where it becomes a bit of a pain, right? If we kind of if we haven't closed all the gaps, you spend a lot of time kind of chasing your tail, looking for these little kind of holes here. But again, it's still a million times quicker than trying to, sort of paint on masking fluid or something like that. And the thing with masking fluid is, once you kind of take it off, you can't go and redo that. Whereas with this, we've always got these selections. So the basic, thesis I would say when it comes to flatting is, with the line and color style, the advantage is that you have defined the edges in a solid way, right? When it comes to line and color, what we've done is we've defined our edges. We've made them solid. Now, with painting and art, edge control is just a major factor of everything we do, controlling the edges. With line and color style, we've controlled the edges. We've made them solid, right? There's a line there. Now, if I've made a line there, that means I'm not going to have to paint into that or decide, oh, is that now a soft edge or a hard edge? The edge control is done. And once I've made that decision that this is where the line goes, this is where the edge goes, I don't ever want to have to go back and redo the same edge again, because there's no value to it. I've drawn it with a line. I've delineated the edge. I shouldn't need to ever delineate that edge ever again, from an efficiency and a productivity point of view. So that's where making these masks and sort of defining this that way, I think is kind of really helpful. I've just kind of noticed that I should have, right? I should have cut this out. And I'll sort of show you. Yeah. Boom. So if I do cut this out, right, if we sort of zoom in, these are the kind of problems that you will that you will run into. Right, so zoom in. If I do kind of cut this out, boom, see it's sort of gone, but now I've got sort of a hard edge. So it does really make a lot of sense to, right, like modify, right, expand by 1 pixel, and then again we could kind of like select, modify, feather, right? Can we do 0.5? I don't know whether we can, but yeah. So if I sort of do this, right, that's going to give me a slightly better effect. So it's important to always understand like how and why these little things are working. So that you can go in and fix them. That's why to a certain degree, like, you know, it's like you can get the action, but it's so easy to, with these actions, like run it, and then it just sort of doesn't work, and you're like, what am I doing wrong? So you need to both know how the action's working, and then what you need to know how actions work in and of themselves, so you can sort of troubleshoot it if something goes wrong, and you also need to know like what it's actually doing in the first place. So it's good at automating things that you understand, and the best way I would sort of go about Photoshop automation is to just keep doing stuff until it becomes really boring and you know every single step, and then you can just sort of record an action and you know enough about it to sort of fix it and sort of troubleshoot it if something goes wrong. But so much of this really, you know, can get very tricky. You know, this one of these actions kind of did stop working for me when Photoshop updated, and that became immensely frustrating. But yeah, there we go. We're sort of done. All right, we got the whole thing. Boom. Done. I'm just going to select these old versions of the lines. Control G, put them in a group. All right, let's turn our stuff back on. And yeah, let's do the first step here, which is to just kind of block in most of the basic colors that I think we're going to need for everything. Right, so we sort of got that back there, right? Then this one is going to be a bit darker, right? Then this one is going to be a bit darker still. And then we got the foreground, which, no, the foreground is kind of green, right? The foreground here is kind of like that, and then this one is kind of like that. This one is maybe a little bit in between. Yeah, so we got something like that. So you can just sort of rough it in, right? This is giving us a rough indication of, you know, sort of how those kind of flats are going to go. And essentially from here, it's just a matter of taking the things from here and sort of adding them here. So that's essentially what we've got to do. So again, let me know in the comments down below. Everyone asks me, you know, how those sort of actions and more complicated selections work in Photoshop. I always feel like it's super boring to go through that because it just feels like, you know, we're just sort of getting into full Photoshop nerd territory. But again, you know, that stuff is super valuable. And again, I do cover all of that stuff in all of the sort of courses I run and stuff like that. And that's often where I find the best place for it is because, you know, we can sort of go super deep and you know, sort of give out lots of Photoshop files and things to play around with and test and follow along, etc. But yeah, anyway, let's just keep adding flats to this. I'm going to start with the character. And we'll just see what we got going here. Right, got the character here. And I'm going to start by kind of putting in the undertone of this And I'm doing it pretty far out, right? We could zoom in, right? That would be somewhat beneficial. But there is something to be said for, again, just sort of going a little bit quicker in the beginning, and often some of these little bits and pieces don't actually make a huge difference. And there is a whole art to this flatting, where we want to think about what overlaps what. We want to get, again, the thing you kind of notice is that, as I was sort of hinting at, dark colors overlapping sort of light colors, and light colors overlapping dark colors is something you really want to get. We want to avoid as much as possible having like little bits of stuff left everywhere. That's where it'll always look a little bit amateurish. So you need to kind of think about the sequence that you're working in, right? Like what goes first, what goes second. And yeah, try and practice this. It's a bit like another one of these crossword puzzle things. The you kind of got to figure out the sequence to do it, to make sure that you kind of spend the least amount of time fussing over it. And again, I'm just starting, we're just doing very, very basic, blobby kind of flats, right? I don't need to do anything that crazy. I've got all this kind of detail with the lines. This is, hopefully, we'll see. This is the beauty of the line and color process, is that, the lines and the color do most of what we need to do. So here you can see, right, I'm flatting, and this is not 100%, this is not pixel perfect. Often when I'm going quickly, again, I'm trying to figure out like what's actually gonna make a difference. And often, when we do get it super tight and super perfect, it doesn't always end up being that much better. I know that sounds weird, but sometimes a little bit of organicness can go a long way. All right. But yeah, and this is another one of those, similar to the inking. This is just a chill out sort of phase. But I think the more that you do engage with these phases, the more you get to think about the artwork, and you kind of notice little things, right? You notice like, oh yeah, that's off. I'm going to need to think about that. You kind of spot things coming. One of the challenges with getting, sort of other people to do the flats, I've often found this because I have done this from time to time, is that, if something's not working, it's very hard for me to tell why. Because I don't have any knowledge of it. I haven't tried to, right? I haven't tried to fix it or anything. Boom. Right. And so, it's very easy to get sort of blindsided by problems, right? Something comes along and like, oh, why isn't this working? I got no idea. Whereas I find when I flat it, I've got I can sort of see those things coming because I, get a jump on them. All right. So again, just trying to get all these basic shapes happening. And we can, the good thing about the line and color process as well is, I'm flatting this with the pencil tool. So it's very easy for me to go in there and just eyedrop, right? I can just say, oh, let's see if this is red, right? And it's non-destructive. If I sort of go in there, you can see, we zoom up, it's just changing it at the pixel level, When you're using the drag and drop things, in some of the other programs that allow it to be automated, it's a lot easier. But it is destructive often, which is to say that you get sharpening and weird things happen as you kind of keep dragging and dropping and messing around. So it's easy to kind of keep dragging and dropping and changing the color and then, accidentally, essentially, you kind of get a bit of artifacting and those kind of weird little halos here and there, from my experience anyway. And with all programs, there's ways to avoid this. There's tricks. There's all that kind of stuff. But generally, I still don't think we're quite there in terms of just anyone. It's sort of set it and forget it. You just drag and drop. It'll always work, unless you're kind of dealing with a vector program, right? Which is similar to a bitmap sort of idea, where there's no softness. There's no the computer doesn't have to make a decision about what's in and what's outside the lines. So I missed a bit here, so I'm just turning off the locking of the opacity with the question mark, turn it back on, and then we continue. All right, let's fill that. And so again, we can leave a few little bits and pieces here and there. It's probably not going to make a huge bit of difference. And like I often feel, that we need to delete this. So let's see. I'll just delete that and we'll see whether we get some artifacting, right? That'll be a good little thing to kind of spot. Often it adds a little bit of character, right? To have some, like a few little bits and pieces. It makes it feel a little bit more hand done. Have a few little bits of mess here and there. The trick is just to make sure that we're getting the tonality right. And by that I mean, if you kind of have a whole bunch of nice warm gray tones and they're kind of touching each other and, there's a bit of painterliness to it, that's fine, right? If you kind of have, here we've got like yellow on sort of a browny color, right? I need to make sure that these are a little bit more accurate, right? If it really sort of sticks out, it's really going to sort of stick out. So it's all a matter of what exactly you're doing. So I noticed that I did have a bit of this blue in here. I have no idea whether or not that's actually going to work. All right. And again, we can always adjust the skin color here. Sometimes, sometimes things that work at the sketch phase don't necessarily work on the final phase. But I am going to add, again, like a little bit of a little bit of redness. And here. So yeah, the workstation is starting to chug with this file because it's quite a big file now. And often what I do, actually, now that I think about it, I often do res these down for the final color phase. Let's add some of that redness to the ears. It's something I'm always doing for a little bit of subtlety, and you can really affect the feeling of the eyes just by how we kind of actually put in the flats there. So it's very possible to really kind of tweak things from just that final emotional effect right at the end. Again, same with the mouth, right? The precise shape here, right, really changes the look, and you can still mess around with that right at the end. Anyway, yeah, we'll see how we go. So I kind of want some of these bracelets to be like gold. Right. Don't. So we'll see whether making the bird literally the same color as the cape kind of works. Might be good to just like have it like look like 2% different or something. So this stuff is like super super rough. Right, got the slightly darker thing. We got the slightly darker beak. And again, you could play around with the patterning here. Change the look of it. There's some fun experimentation to be had. Create some more interesting shapes. Right, and then let's see if we can. Oh, that's a bit dark. Do these claws down here. Cool. Gold. 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 What else we got here? So you just go along. Again, this is like a pretty complicated character design. I'd probably try and simplify this quite a bit if I was making it a comic, because you can see that, just adding these little bits and pieces is, taking up quite a bit of time. And what I would generally do is just put in all these flats. Like, let's not worry about, again, I'm not 100% sure on the skin tone. Feels a bit kind of yellow and a little bit dead. But let's wait till the end, right? Let's wait till we get everything in. I think that's always the best bet. Wait until it's all kind of sorted. All right, bit of gold there. But the main thing that's going to matter here is the character. In terms of flatting and getting everything kind of accurate, right? A lot of this is gonna go pretty quickly once we sort of figure this out. Because it really is just a picture of the character, right? Like there's not a lot. There's not a lot to it. So yeah, this is literally just coloring book stuff. Boom. And yeah, organizing your day is important as a freelancer. And normally I try and organize this type of stuff, as I was saying, for when we're right at the end of the day or something like that. That's what it is now. If I need to stop, I can just stop. I can pick this up in the morning. I can, do a little bit at night. It's not, it's not sort of do or die. Boom, put that in there. So you can see, for instance, that, if I go over the lines a little bit here, it's not a big deal, right? They're two sort of very, very kind of similar colors. It's not a big problem. So here's where, again, I could, I could kind of create that. And then you can use the selections that you have to help you create other selections. Again, the fundamental logic is that I shouldn't be redoing any sort of line or series of kind of edges again. Once I've done it once, that should be enough. So here again, I can select this, and yeah, let's look at maybe just making this one just a little bit darker. So again, not sure. I feel like this could be this kind of blue again. Sort of worked pretty well. Again, this should probably that shouldn't be red. And should probably push these eyes, make them kind of white. Yeah, I feel like that kind of works. All right. So yeah, getting there. We're like pretty much done. All right, got some of this gold here. And yeah, I think that'll sort of do for an initial kind of blocking. Again, most stuff is kind of there. Yeah, it's kind of working all right. And really the next stage is mostly going to be a matter of, putting in this kind of blue. And we'll see if it works. Because remember, we didn't have the blue in the actual original. Kind of color plan. So it's going to work even without the blue. We've got a simple, harmonious, analogous color scheme. Yeah, so another technique you can use when flatting is to kind of outline things, really sort of think about. Let's go to foreground. Yep, so create little outlines of all the little flowers, and then you can fill them all at once. So again, this stuff can be pretty rough too. Let's start with the foreground here though. Again, we can always go through, like even right at the end, you can go through and do a final pass, like clean these things up. If we go a little bit over the lines or something. All right, here we've got that. All right, so let's check back in with our color plan. See how we're going, because I think this is where probably, yeah, I think probably some of this, right? Like some of this is kind of green. Right, but only a little bit of it, right? So we got a bit there, and also got some of this that was kind of green. So I'm just trying to kind of match what was there, right? Like that's the basic idea. So we have to zoom up to this. You can see it's getting pretty messy. But it's not going to make much difference. And again, there's messy and then there's being loose, right? And often it's a matter of just being a little bit more deliberate when we want to be loose. Right, so just thinking, okay, maybe we don't need to, flatten in all of those areas. Yeah, but let's just try and be as kind of playful as we want, as we can with it. Make slightly smaller brush. Boom. So yeah, starting to get a feel. And again, what I'm going to try and do is, like add a little bit of tonality here. Maybe indicating that some of those branches are sort of showing through. Right, just adding little bits and pieces. Same thing over here. Now this is probably a little bit more of a problem because, right, we sort of got this, but again, I need to go through, be a little bit more brushy, paint this out. Well, I think that'll work too. Yeah. Yeah, so just a matter of continuing on, keep flatting. But yeah, this is mostly done. If we kind of step back, you can see we're starting to get it to come together. Now, one of the things is, when you sort of remove that sketchiness, this is going to look for sort of very bold and strong and like, again, like maybe it's a bit much. We're going to tone it down. We're going to look at subtleties and how to kind of finish it off. But yeah, you can kind of see it. It sort of comes together. I think like, a lot of it is kind of working pretty well. What we'll do is, sort of keep going with this and then, finally start to look at, what can we do to make it more subtle, add atmosphere, add a little bit more sophistication to the color. And then, right at the end, we can come along and, try and sort of plus it, maybe add some subtle color adjustments, etc. But yeah, this is probably a stage where you can kind of zoom out, look at it and kind of, compare it to the thumbnail and kind of go like, look, is it the same thing? Does it kind of work? Because now we got the face, we got all those details. And often what we might want to do is, again, pull a bit more focus towards the face, or, not quite sure what we do. So, yeah, but for now, we got to do a little bit more flatting. So let's keep going with this. And the trick here is to, I guess, figure out how to get that feeling that we had with the original. I think when we're flatting, we have a color plan. The best thing to do is, I have a feeling that there's going to be a couple of tricks I'm going to want to employ, basically. But I think the first thing always that will help you is just to say, let's just flat in the colors that we think need to be there. And this really just means go through, just chill out, and put in those basics. And I think if we do that, in most cases, what we find is that it doesn't take that long, and it will go pretty easy, pretty cruisy. So it does take a while when you are flatting to really get into a good groove with it and learn when you can employ your style. But I have found that being able to add little flourishes that, do resonate with your style does help the overall artwork a lot. And I think if you play around with it, you can get a lot out of being suggestive with the way that we make these strokes. And you also get into the flow for when it comes to actually, sort of changing things, adding a little bit of extra, right? A little bit of extra, right? So, a little bit of extra personality, right? So here, right, for instance, I can start to think about like how do we flat this? All right, I've kind of got all these different bits and pieces here, but do I want to add another color here? Like, is it better for me to just kind of play around, use this, right? Like maybe something simpler is better. Maybe it's better for me to just go in here with with this sort of two-tone effect. I think it's very hard to figure some of that stuff out if you're getting someone else to flat it, or if you are, being sort of tentative in the beginning, right? There's a lot of sort of texture and sophistication that I can add by, again, suggesting with the little kind of marks I make. I'm just using round brush here, right? So that's all I'm doing is just using round brush. And if I kind of practice a bit, I think I can. Now I will be going over this, right? This is very harsh. I will be kind of adding some gradients over this to kind of really sort of make it work. But again, sometimes less is more. And sometimes here, if I kind of make some interesting marks, the whole thing will sort of start to come together. Because often, like, digital art does suffer from being very monodimensional, right? It is often harder to get some of that texture. And if you kind of really go in there and try and make every mark clean, if I sort of go in there and try and sort of trace everything, it's less likely that I'm going to get some of these brush strokes to really pop and get some feeling of texture, right? Whereas if I kind of try and break up some of this texture in the background, it's almost like I'm adding a little bit of tone. Again, we do need to tone it down, right? But I'm being a little bit blobby with it, but I think that again gives us that more high frequency detail in the background, which I think we need. We need these simple lines, right? I don't want to go crazy by adding leaves and things here. We still want this simplified version of it, but also there's a feeling where we want the background to have more high frequency of detail. Oh, there we go. Computer is wigging out a bit. There we go. Boom. Yeah. So yeah, I think that works. Now it's a little bit rough, and this is what I mean, right? If we sort of zoom up here, you can see that this is not exactly sort of perfect, but I think in some cases this is going to work just as well, if not better. And we'll see if we can sort of add some of this to other areas of the image as well. Yeah, and here again, I kind of want to break up, paint a little bit of this kind of tone behind. Right, here we go. What's in front? And honestly, I think, right, I think this is kind of working. And again, I'm trying to do a bit of that here. So on the, again, we kind of had two tones a little bit. So I'm going to do a similar, oh, that one was not locked. So let's lock that. So similar thing here, similar idea. And there's a lot that you could do with, really playing around with like blending modes. There's a lot of different ways you can add the shadow. But the process that I'm using here is a little bit different to, some of the other sort of techniques that, I'm normally kind of teaching when it comes to adding shadow. Is I'm really just sort of picking these colors and I'm making them kind of flat. And I think this gives the whole image a little bit more of an authentic feel, right? It feels a little bit more hand painted, a little bit less artificial, which I think is very useful. All right, so what else have we got there? I think that is about it. I do feel like here for this, I feel like for this tree in particular, this one does seem a little bit bigger. I think we could probably put the darker sort of tone on that. Yeah, I think that's starting to balance out well. All right, we got this. That's looking kind of done to me. That looks done. Here, I think, is where we've got still a little bit of the work to go. So here we've got some of these sort of darker tones, right? And some of these kind of lighter ones. Again with the green. Got some blue, blue, blue. And my strategy, as I've sort of said before, is let's kind of, again, there's different strategies you could have. You could go in there and do it just tightly. I'm kind of using the technique where I kind of blob it in, and then if I feel like, it's really not working, let's zoom in, right, and have another go. And often, again, there's pluses and minuses to each kind of approach. Some are faster, some are slower, some are more reliable. Oh. But the main thing that's the most important is that with the outline and the silhouettes here, we're not going over, right? We're not going outside the lines where it really matters. And what we're going to try and do is kind of think of all of these different layers as being one kind of image. So we have some texture on them, right? They've got different elements on them. But the main thing that really matters is the way that, if we think about, just as a good example, right? If I was to, this will probably create a huge sort of fuss, right? But, right, so if I was to add some atmosphere here, you can see that the key thing is that, right, this is kind of maintaining its integrity from an outline perspective. Let's get rid of that and keep going. Okay, so here, what is on this? Yeah, we got all of these things. Put some more blue here. Right, same thing here. And just adding, all those little squiggles, right, that felt a bit like, oh, do we need this? When we're doing the lines. Yeah, it makes a big difference here, I think, because we just got that extra level of complexity. Yeah, cool. All right. So now we go back to the character. And you can see now that I've kind of added in some of that other sort of detail, we can kind of see that, yeah, some of this is a bit rough now. So let's go through. See if we can clean this up a bit. What? And one thing that's worth looking at this stage is just adjusting a couple of things that are often a little bit tricky, that can often get out of whack. One is the hair color and the skin color. So I'm going to select wand and I'm going to turn off contiguous, because this means that basically everything with that tonality, right, everything with that skin color gets selected. And here we can really mess with it, right? I could make it, right, sort of darker. I think what I'll do, actually, let's go back. See if we can add in all these other little elements. So I think that'll help us. So we're going to go hue saturation. This is going to allow us to really kind of push the basics, right? Make it darker, make it lighter, right? What have we got here? Make it, so I think making it a little bit more kind of red. Maybe we could make it a little bit lighter. I mean, I think that does kind of work. Same kind of tonality, just a little bit less sort of yellow. All right, but we can still mess around with that. So I'm going to do, so it's doing a weird selection thing because the file, I think, in the computer is having issues. Okay, let's go hue saturation. All right. Okay, Can we make this, or should we make this darker? Could make it lighter. Again, I'm not against making it lighter. I think that's kind of sort of like, it has a cool sort of fantasy vibe. And you know, it's pretty easy to make some different options. Now you can see here that because that because I was kind of focusing on this hair being darker, we don't notice that it kind of slipped over here. And that's exactly why you need to really sort of focus on understanding whether or not you're going to flat something in dark or light in the beginning. If you kind of get all your tonal arrangements right, it means you can be much more brushy with your sort of flatting application. If I get it wrong, and you know, with the flats, and I make something that should be dark light, it means that often if I'm being brushy with it, you really see the difference as it's kind of going to bleed in, and little areas where it didn't matter, suddenly it will really, 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 really matter. All right, so thinking about what kind of color we should have here. So again, we can play around with different things. I definitely think it needs to be darker than it was. And I think it would be good to maybe get some of that sort of darkness or like coolness to sort of exist in some of these other areas, because they were all feeling a little bit like they're kind of picked from the same color, which they were. Oh, I'm gonna, let's hit contiguous. Can't believe I missed that one. Let's do select, modify. Let's see if that works. Yeah. I think actually, now that I think about it, this as well. So this time I'm going, because these are quite small, I'm going to modify smooth. It's just going to smooth it out a little bit. And then let's go like select, modify, feather. Let's try that. Yeah, I think that's like pretty good. I think that's kind of how it was meant to be. But I think maybe it's kind of just better like that. All right. Anyway. So these feel right, like maybe we could change this as well, right? Like maybe these feel like they're too similar. Too similar to these other blues. And maybe with these we could make this, right, even more red. Yeah. Yeah, and this is where, you know, we can play around with some of these ideas. I maybe think like that's a little bit more sort of subtle, right? Like this is a bit on the nose, having this be fully blue. That's really hard to say. Maybe could we blend them? So go paint bucket. I'm going to select 20%, and then I'm going to kind of blend this in. Yeah, so it's like sort of halfway between. I mean, I feel like that's a little bit better. Again, this is all stuff where, it's very easy to change this, to mess around with it. I feel like that feels a little bit more subtle. But again, who knows whether we want subtle. So here's another thing that we could do, right? We've got a lot of this. I'm going to go back to contiguous. All right, let's select all of this kind of red. And what I'm going to do is just go with like a pretty small, low opacity. I'm just going to see if I can separate out some of them. All right, just make them slightly different tonalities, just so it's a bit more sophisticated. Yeah, I think that is probably a good thing. See if we can add that there. Yeah, and also, yeah, let's think about these fingernails. This is where, like maybe I could put that fingernail in there, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. All right. So I feel like I still want to play around with the general sort of tonality of the character, but there's a couple of things that I think are probably worth doing first as we sort of progress again past the flatting stage into some of the others. But I think that there's still a few things that really would be useful to do here on the foreground. Right, so you can see that's kind of how it was, and yeah, I think that's a big improvement. So let's look at this foreground. Let's make sure we put in this, and also what I want to do is make sure, and we kind of had this in the we kind of had this here in the thumbnail, right? Like a kind of a darker greeny blue for this. So again, here we can get this out. Yeah, I think that's working a lot better. So we could also try and put some of this foregroundy stuff a little bit more forward. All right, I'm just going to go a bit more towards the green, a bit more towards here, a bit more towards here. So in terms of, so we kind of like done with the flatting, right? Like a lot of what I've been doing is, in terms of color wheels and color theory, it's just kind of working with the original sort of set of ideas that we had. But here's where we need to kind of think about the theory. So I could look at the wheel, right? The color wheel. I've got HSB there as well. And so here I can, understand that what we're dealing with is an analogous color scheme. So if you remember, going back to our color wheel, right? Wrong side. It's got different stuff on each side, right? I'm looking at an analogous color scheme. So we're looking at sort of yellows and all the way, right, from greens to blues. That's kind of the idea. So basically, yellows and greens, and again a bit of blue, and I've added quite a bit of blue. Right, we have a few little reds, again a little bit of sort of pop there. So when I'm looking at picking colors here, what I'm doing is looking from a color wheel perspective, right? We've got sort of yellow, right? And I'm really just looking on this arc of the color wheel here. That's all I'm sort of doing. And you can see what that does is on the hue slider is it's just kind of moving it around here. Right? So you can see here I've got my sort of yellow. If I dip here, I'm into red, and basically I'm just going to stick from yellow all the way over here to blue, right? And that's basically the same thing here. Now, in terms of saturation, you can see that really this is just moving the sort of color wheel triangle thing. It's kind of moving it from this side to this side, right? Here we've got white, which is, sort of desaturated, and here we've got black. So that's all that's kind of happening. Here I'm just making it, if I slide the B slider, the balance, the black slider, I'm basically putting more black, more sort of darkness into it. If I slide the saturation, it's basically like how much color is coming out of the tube. Is it very saturated or is it low saturation? And that's all that's happening. So the color wheel, the HSB sliders, most of these sliders do very similar things. HSB and color wheel, I feel like, are a little bit more artist friendly. Some people do understand the CMYK key and the RGB, and they kind of get into that brain space and use it. I'd say if you're not quite sure about any of those things, again, HSB sliders and the color wheel are a really good way to kind of understand, because they inherently allow you to understand where the analogous colors are. Obviously, that you have to remember what is opposite what if you're using the sliders, but the main reason I use the sliders is because they take up less room, and I used to be using really small screens, but now it's like, I'm like, oh, it probably doesn't even matter. Anyway, so as I'm sort of selecting colors, the reason I kind of bring us back to color theory is that now I am choosing colors again, right? I previously was kind of just saying, let's stick a little bit darker, a little bit lighter. And that's all I've kind of done there. But as we sort of look here, what I'm trying to do is pick colors that are darker, but sort of feel more green, because I am representing some of these sort of mossy tops of the rocks. And again, what I'll do is I'll select this again, hit W, boom, and I'll put a bit of that sort of green on there. So the way that I normally get to these colors, because I think this is often what trips us up, right? When we're kind of looking for, you kind of understand the theory, but the question is like, how do you kind of pick the colors, right? So all I'm doing is I'm trying to sort of stick to the basic tonality that I had, and there's a couple of different ways you can do this, right? I can select these kind of blues, and I can say, let's move this, right? So here I have a blue, right? And I kind of just want to move it a little bit more towards the green, right? That's all I'm doing. I'm saying, well, let's move it a little bit more towards the green. And you can see, right, this is what it gives me. If I kind of zoom up, it's going to let me, right? It's not really making much difference, right? Here you can see it's going to, right, it's going to make a bit of difference. It's going to make it green. But I also want to say, well, I also want it to feel a bit lighter, right? So I'm just going to push the balance up so it's a little bit less black, right? And that's going to give me, a kind of a lighter green that's going to go there. So typically that's how I'm going to do things, right? Is I'm sort of looking at like what color's there. Okay, that's a blue. And what I want to do is make the blue more green. I'm not going to pick green, right? I'm not going to pick a sort of a, this is, I think, often the mistake we make is like, I'm going to pick a green, right? And the green is not working. We need to be much more natural than that. So I'm sort of picking these colors that we already have, and a lot of these is kind of sort of neutral blues, and I'm working within that, right? So I'm picking some of the neutral blues we have, and I'm saying, well, this is in the foreground. You can imagine it's kind of in shadow. It's a tertiary reed, so nothing Nothing there I want to add a lot of contrast, but I do need to kind of add some stuff, you know. I do want to kind of say, okay, let's add a bit of contrast, right? I might want to say, let's try and pick out a few of these strands of sort of grass, right? There's many different sort of things that we could do here to make this a bit more interesting. Right, just add a little bit of stuff so it doesn't feel quite as flat. But what I'm trying to do is just get enough contrast. So with color, it's all a matter of subtle contrast. And what we're often after, what I'm after is, I need this to feel as if it is more green and it is a little bit lighter. And I need it to feel just enough that it is more green and a little bit lighter, so that you recognize that's the key that we're trying to go for. It needs to be just enough that you recognize, oh, that is a slightly lighter color and it is more green, right? So again, if I was to make this sort of blue, right, it's gonna have a subtle effect, but I really want that to be green. So if we actually look at the color, you can see most of these colors, right? If I sort of pick both of these colors next to each other, right? They're both kind of muddy, greeny, bluey colors, right? They're kind of not really anything vibrant or interesting. And that is most of the time what you're trying to do, is pick very kind of subtle colors. Again, here I've got a green and I've got a different type of green, right? If you look at them next to each other on the color, right? So I'm picking one as foreground, one as background, right? They look almost the same. You probably wouldn't be able to pick it out, but next to each other, one is more green than the other. And that's mostly what we're sort of concerned with. All right, so I've added this stuff here, and this really does, solve the majority of the problem that I was trying to solve there, in terms of just putting in that extra sort of flatting that needs flatting in the foreground. But before I move on, what I want to try and do is add a few sort of simple gradients. And this is where this probably will start to, you might be better off doing this right at the end of your process, because it is going to really destroy the computer. But actually, before I kind of do that, what might be good to do is play around with something I was kind of saying that I thought I might need to do, which is to kind of add a bit of extra sort of painting behind here, just to kind of soften this up. And make it a little bit less like these kind of clean lines. Now, this is something, again, I do all of these things on layers, and, I'm always prepared to kind of turn them off, right, if it doesn't work. But this is just something that I think might kind of come in handy. Now, what am I doing? I'm doing it as a very abstract thing, right? What am I doing? I'm just kind of putting blobs everywhere, right? It's just going to add a little bit of extra complexity. Now, I'm going to treat what I just did, the background. So I've got this background, I've got these blobs I put in, and I've got this stuff here, which is the sort of first layer of the background. And I'm kind of going to treat that, I'm going to make a new layer in between. And let's just make some layers in between kind of everything, because this will allow me to just quickly add some atmosphere. Yeah, I'm going to treat all of this the same, and I'm just going to pick that sort of background. Let's make it a little bit lighter. I'm going to make this a bit smaller. We'll just run a gradient up there and kind of see what we get. And that's probably going to be a bit strong. All right, let's sort of change the opacity there. And again, it might be a matter of like, right, making that a sort of a vertical flip, you know, so it's kind of fading up from the bottom. But yeah, I think probably coming from the top is right. Now, all I'm going to do is just try and sort of duplicate it here. And this is where the particular technique that I'm using can really, with the lines, can start to pay off. Because I can actually clip that just to these, right? I can actually clip, because the lines are clipped to the flats, and because the flats allow the lines to be clipped to the flats because they include some of the actual line work as part of the flat. I know it sounds complicated, but it means that you're able to sort of clip them all together and you don't get the line work being chopped off. It also means one of the benefits, right? If we kind of zoom in, I'll show you this with the character because it'll probably be a bit easier. It means that I can easily not have just a constant kind of build up of those different elements, right? So if you keep stacking atmosphere, you kind of then have to adjust one layer, adjust another one, adjust this one, adjust that one. It can get a little bit sort of fussy, yeah, which we kind of don't want, right? So just pushing the opacity there, and this is where, you know, that's just a normal layer, right? But you could play around with, you know, in the same vein, maybe like a overlay or a hard light layer or something like that, and try and sort of pull these down. And again, what it's doing is it's homogenizing those colors a little bit. Yeah, and we could also do that here. Let's try that. So you can see that's kind of what's happening. And what it's doing is just simplifying those shapes a little bit. If I did it there as well, that is not going to work, but we could, right, kind of do it like that. So all that's kind of doing is sort of simplifying those shapes a little bit. Yeah, and that kind of gives us, you know, less of that kind of day glow sort of comic booky look. But I'm not sure we actually need that there. All right. So here, I think we've done that. Let's go here and so this is where probably what we want to do is let's find that sort of pale blue color again, but this time let's move to a big airbrush. I'm just going to see if we can kind of push that back. Now that's probably a little bit much, and this is where, you know, the computer will start to chug here, right? It will start to go a bit sort of crazy because we're sort of pushing it pretty hard. But again, I'm just going to dial that back just for now. And you can see now, you know, a lot of these colors are starting to homogenize because I'm basically just putting lighter colors over them. Now, this is where we're moving a little bit away from the brightness and the vibrancy of the thumbnail, but again, that's okay because I can always sort of bring that back, and mostly what I'm trying to do is separate everything and really sort of get that character to pop. So here we have the character themselves, and what I'm going to do is try and sort of pick like one of these sort of green colors, something that's kind of very base, maybe this kind of thing here, and we're going to kind of run that up the entire character. And that's really kind of toning it down. Now, it's not necessarily what we want, but what we find is that just like a bit of this subtlety of this gradient will really add quite a lot of sort of vibrancy. Now, there's a lot of ways we could kind of play with this, right? I could, let's go and select all of that. Let's just say, yeah, let's do that, but let's not do it on that sort of fancy cloak, right? And I could even do that as a mask, and that means that, I can sort of turn that on or off, or, right, that is sort of a flat mask. I can go levels on that and actually sort of push that back a little bit. So here, this is where deeper knowledge of Photoshop and the subtleties there can really kind of help to, give you many tools. Understanding how to, extract elements from these flats, right? So I've sort of got the flats. It should be easy for me to say, well, okay, I'm going to tone everything down, but this gives me a really easy way to select the cape or her skin or the bird, and then I can kind of create adjustments where I, use that selection to, sort of take away some of that sort of toning down or add a little bit of extra vibrancy. So again, this stuff really kind of helps. But I think, again, hopefully you can see like just a little bit of that subtlety there where we're kind of blending in some of those colors. For me, to my mind, this kind of helps quite a bit. I feel like... yeah. Yeah, it just makes it feel a bit more sophisticated. So I kind of think that kind of works. Now let's look at the other thing we could do is say, well, okay, I've kind of done that to underneath the lines, but we could also clip to the top of the lines some of this sort of atmosphere. Let's actually clip it. This is where we're going to be super subtle. Right, doing a few big marks. I'm just going to kind of erase out where we've got the big, right, the big character sort of face, right? This is where I've got my primary read. Right, so doing a lot of this, right, we kind of put, right, again, let's put a lot of atmosphere there, right, but that's probably too much. Right, then let's take it out. And this is, I can feel my computer here sort of really chugging. The other workstation I have behind me has much more RAM. This has got 64 gigs of RAM. The other one has 128. And that kind of does make a difference when you're working at this size. Really sort of makes a big difference to how much you can just kind of throw around these big files. Probably what I should do is save this file. Let's see how big it is. Boom, boom. Yeah, it's sort of gone to about 700 sort of megabytes. It was at about like a few hundred. It's just all the gradients really take up space. All right. Next, let's look at adding a bit of atmosphere and homogenizing the colors of all of these foreground elements. So I'm going to take this here and all right, see if we can just take some of it back. Yeah, there we go. Right. See if we can just kind of make it a bit more. Yeah, just a bit less kind of front and center. All right, let's take this, and here again, I do want this to kind of maintain its sort of darkness, right? So we've got that, and then lastly we've got these last foreground elements. This is where I'm just kind of going to tone them back a bit around the periphery. Then we'll kind of bring it back here. And what we can even do is, it will be possible to play around with this, later on. But we could sort of, again, pull them back out. Or I can make a new layer and really... Oh. Yeah, Photoshop, it's really slowing down now. So it's basically when we hold the button down to make it bigger, it's kind of lagging. But yeah, here. See if we can make them a lot brighter. Right, so we really get that kind of pop here and there. Yeah, again, a lot of it is just depth, right? We don't, you probably should make these flowers in the foreground very dark, right? That would probably be the logical thing to do, but I do want some sort of vibrancy there. The key is just a little bit of variety, so they don't all seem quite perfectly flat. And I think we're kind of getting there. So same with the foreground that is kind of here. Same with this, right? I feel like we could here again be trying to create a bit of variety with this, right? Maybe one side of it is slightly, sort of lighter than the other. Yeah, and all those little bits will kind of make a big difference. So yeah, here I've got, this is getting pretty close. So what I'm going to do actually is we'll take a quick break, and I'm just going to close everything in Photoshop so it kind of doesn't, keep sort of chugging, because it's starting to slow down quite a bit. And then we'll sort of look at the final kind of touches that we can add. But again, I really feel like, that the general idea here is sorted. If we kind of look at it versus the sort of initial thumbnail, I feel like we could add in some more of the sort of striking nature of the yellow, and we could kind of really push that. But I feel like we've sort of massaged things down. I've sort of made it a little bit more sophisticated. And often that's kind of what we need to get things to look a bit more realistic, right? We're essentially taking a lot of the atmospheric color and sort of giving us that idea that, like, when you're standing under a tree, a lot of the light is bouncing off the green, it's bouncing onto you, it's bouncing off the green, the sky. So, if you kind of go stand under a green tree or in a forest, you'll become a bit green, right? Because all the light is bouncing off green stuff. And there's kind of just a general ambient fill light that is relative to the environment. So using that sort of painting and, sort of lighting theory with the lighting color process, all we're doing is kind of saying, let's take some of that environmental color and make sure that we kind of just paint a little bit of it everywhere. And that'll make it feel more realistic. And I feel like that's a good counterpoint to the very sort of stylized look that it tends to have, right? So it's like, this is just perfect. This is just my kind of stylistic affectation and the reason that I'm doing it this way. Again, you could go for super bright, eye bleed colors, whatever you want. But what I like to do is try and balance that. And this is, I guess, the theory behind that. So this is a little bit more bright. This is a little bit more vibrant. But I think that's good because I've toned it down. And now we can really look at, how we kind of bring it across the line. So let's add some texture, a few little sort of finishing touches, and then we'll look at sort of whether we can plus the color a bit. Now, I've dragged in a texture group that has a bunch of really sort of high res texture on it, right? And you can kind of see that here. If I sort of zoom up, this is the same sort of texture that I use for the Star Atlas Core graphic novels, and it has a mix of paper texture and noise on it. Now this is really going to sort of give things a particular look. But again, I think this kind of works pretty well, but we'll turn it off because it will slow things down quite a bit. The other thing that I'm going to do is behind the character, probably just behind the character. Let's see if we can add a few little bits of dust particle things, which is sort of just one of those sort of cheap tricks I often like to use. And the reason for this is, it's just going to hopefully do a bit of what I was trying to do with these things here, right in the background. It's just going to try and maybe, hopefully, add a bit of complexity to the background. So I'm going to put some of that in. And yeah, I'll kind of fade some of it out as well. Again, I feel like sometimes it just adds that little bit of stuff. Now, I think I'm going to move it. Let's see if we can move it here. Yeah, I think that'll be kind of fine too, because mostly what I'm sort of worried about is this kind of mess here that, I didn't really kind of clean up or do a great job of sort of painting, right? But I feel like if we can kind of get some of this going, it might kind of make that a little bit more subtle. But again, kind of gives us this feeling that maybe there's some kind of stuff floating in the sky. It's going to increase the visual complexity of the texture. And this, another thing you can do is, potentially say, well, let's see if we can bring some of this blue in there, right? I can add some color sophistication to a very sort of flat image by modifying and sort of just overlaying little sort of textural bits and pieces. Now, again, you don't need to do too much of it. Often, I'll sort of do this and then I'll, get up the next morning and think about, did I go too far? Do I actually want it to be like that? Yeah, you do have to be kind of subtle. All right. That's probably enough though. There might be some more of that I do in a little bit, but what I kind of noticed is I feel like this right. I'm always trying to find this layer. There we go. Yeah, I feel like this could be a bit lighter. Just so it's not quite so front and center. All right, so pretty close, I feel like. Now we could just in front of the character put a few more, right, very kind of simple splattery textural things. Again, it's just going to give us a bit more visual complexity, etc., etc. Yeah, but again, I feel like we're pretty much there. So let's think about putting that texture back on. Make sure again I haven't added any sort of silly texture in the background that kind of crosses over the character's face or anything. And now let's look at what we could do using a couple of tricks here to really kind of punch things up. So what I'm going to do is look at seeing like, can I really make this yellow more yellow? And then can I use color range to kind of isolate the elements that I actually want to sort of punch up? So again, looking at the the cape. Right, this is kind of what I want. And let's decrease that fuzziness until we sort of lose. You can sort of see a version of it there. Right, this is kind of get rid of that. Right, so again, we can just introduce that sort of really bright yellow. Now that I've got that color range based mask there, we can kind of really play with the precise way that this is kind of giving us that sort of extra yellow, right? Again, that's very subtle, but I feel like that this might be a little bit more true to, we could actually just look at yellows, right? We could easily change the type of yellow, right? Make it more sort of canary yellow, more kind of warm yellow. We could take the black out of it, right? Make it much lighter. Put the black in. I do feel like making it a bit less orange might be a good idea. And we can sort of take this and put it next to our sort of rough options. Let's see if we can do that. Actually, what I'll do is I'll see if I can get a... There we go. Let's get a JPEG of it, because this is the kind of stuff you often have to do if the computer is not cooperating, if it's sort of getting slow, as opposed to opening up the 600 megabyte Photoshop file. Let's do something a bit simpler. So, right, let's look at really trying to match that. Right, that kind of orangey yellow we had, because that did kind of work. Yeah, so if we really kind of go crazy, that's kind of what we'd have. And there's something about that does really work. And we can adjust that mask. I can get out airbrush. Right, see if we can kind of pull it away. Whoop. Pull it away from the back, from the bottom. Really bring it up there. Get the primary read up there. Yeah, I think that kind of works. Yeah, So again, I feel like this is like a good situation where we've matched the thumbnail, right? The thumbnail is actually kind of working. The whole thing is kind of there. And yeah, we're pretty much home and hosed. What you can always try and do is, what I always like to do is just mess around with like, what happens if you drastically, fiddle with the color. And this is often what I do if things aren't working, right? If things aren't working, then we can always look at how, right, how really sort of changing things can help by doing something drastically different, right? And this is a similar sort of gradient that I used previously, but this can work pretty well. So you could do that, or the other thing we could do is we could say, well, yeah, let's let's really focus on just pulling out the character there. So let's delete sort of everything else and just say, look, that's just the character, right? Like maybe if we sort of mostly pull, right? We mostly pull the character there, right? So let's like, have a bit of that, right? It's a little bit of subtlety, right? Again, it's graying it down. It's kind of getting rid of what we did, but the subtlety and the gradient that we get is kind of interesting. And here I've got right, just kind of hitting that with a bit of an overlay. Now we can kind of dial this, right? I could move that there. Let's invert that. So now what I've got is this is controlling just the character. I could really kind of push how much warmth we get. And so again, using the masks, I'm inverting some of them, right? And doing some little things like this can often kind of really help to pull focus. So previously, the plan is still kind of there. Again, here we've got this, right? What we could probably do, right? So that's not going on the character. Again, we could try sort of pulling that back. Yeah. But again, something like this is gonna give things a little bit more sort of subtlety. Again, which one do we like? Do we like this one or that one? It's a little bit warmer, a little bit cooler. What's going to print well, what's not going to print well. We could obviously try and do a view proof setup. Right, could do a custom. Right, and that's going to give us a good indication of how it's going to print. Is it going to work better if we have sort of warm colors? Right. Again, all depends sort of what you're after. But I think the key is to have something that kind of works, right? And then once you have something that works, we can always tweak it. We can always sort of adjust things. We can always make it a little bit more interesting. For me, again, what this does is it puts a little bit more focus on the character. And we've got some cool, let's turn that off. We got some cool blues, right? And reds. We're kind of like pushing the color a little bit more, right? And I feel like this is the point at which it's good to do that, right? Right at the end. If you're looking to experiment and say like, well, what if I kind of broke the color theory a bit? It's always good to do it at the end, to pull little bits and pieces out, to really kind of mess around with it, to experiment. But start with a base that works. A simple color plan, analogous color scheme. You can see I've kind of pulled a lot of that coolness away from the background. But again, that kind of allows me to sort of push, right, some of the, and this is probably like, again, like an even sort of stronger image. Yeah, this allows me to really sort of pull the character forward and make them really sort of pop. So, simple gradients, I think, are another really sort of effective tool. I use them all the time. Everyone's got a gradient tool in most applications, and they work really, really effectively. Most of this adjusting is a matter of subtlety. And this really is the key takeaway at the end. If we crop this out, or the other thing we can do is play around with, sort of exactly what color are these different elements. Right, we could move this. Yeah, that looks kind of cool. All right, add some sort of blue there. Just mess around, right? Like that's normally what I'm trying to do. This makes the character pop a little bit more interesting. You can just kind of mess around with it. But so much of this is about subtlety, right? It's like a little bit here, a little bit there. We're not sort of adding crazy gradients, right? And all of a sudden, like, it sort of changes. You can do that if you really want to, make people's eyes bleed. But often, sticking to that core concept, right? We got the flat colors. That's kind of working. And, the rest is a matter of, sort of modifying from there. Again, adding a little bit of that atmospheric color, a little bit of toning it down, a little bit of, texture. And, again, let's see if we can bring that character forward. I know that my primary read is the face, right? I know that's sort of where I want to go. And, we just need to keep that as your North Star. that's what I want to pop. If we make it warmer, that's good. We've already got sort of coolness in the background. And a lot of what we're trying to do is shift with very effective, simple tools, just gradients and things, airbrushes, just moving things around. I'm trying to make it feel less flat, right? It's flat color, but again, what I'm wanting to do is effectively, quickly move the flat color and get subtlety, so that I start with like, look, all of these blue flowers are the same, but without going in there and manually clicking, click, 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 right? Let's zoom up and I'll sort of zoom around here while we're sort of talking. Yeah, without actually manually going through and like clicking on everything, one by one, I want to be able to change, these blue flowers so that there's some subtlety, because in nature, they're not all going to be the same blue. They're going to be in different lights, different, sort of angles to the light. And, we're going to get that kind of subtlety. And the same thing with the cape. If you kind of look at any wall, it's probably not actually, our brain perceives it as being one tone, but it tends to shift from tone from the bottom to the top. It changes color. Again, if you go stand in a forest, you're going to be a different color. And if you stand if you have a really bright light on one side of you that's a particular color, then you're all going to be sort of lit with that color. Basic stuff. So there is often transitions from one thing to another that are very gradual, and that's what the gradients kind of give you. And just making sure we got all these things on separate layers, right, is just very kind of effective. It's a little bit of a pain in there, but you can see having all these things on separate layers allows me to very, very effectively grade this image to a very sort of high fidelity, right? So we have the same kind of fidelity that you would have in film, where you can literally take, different characters and make them lighter or darker. And that allows you to have a very simple looking style that you can get, very sort of interesting effects from. So again, that's sort of something I wanted to sort of focus on here. And the real key is to, remember that so much of this is just a matter of simple, reliable process. What we want to do here, I'll just get all these kind of stages up so we can kind of check and just remind ourselves of where we've kind of been. This will probably completely chug the computer down. So yeah, we kind of started with our... Right, we started with our sketch, and the sketch is just a plan. Now, how much does it look like our finished product? A little bit, but a lot of the feeling has changed, like the character got a little bit more cartoony, and sort of things modified. But look, the general idea is there. The general idea is there in the thumbnail. You can kind of tell that, these things are related. Again, I really think it's important to understand you can do thumbnails big, you can do them small. They're conceptually a matter of thinking about what the image is like when it's small, when it's simple. If you were to blur the image that's finished, right? So if we were to take this, blur it, and look at it from across the room, that's what the thumbnail is meant to represent. You can do it big, you can do it small. It's not a preliminary rough. It's not where you're trying to figure out detail in secondary form. It's where you're trying to see, does the image read? Does it read from across the room? That's really what we're trying to sort of solve for with the thumbnail. Doesn't matter how big it is, what you do with it, anything. But you can basically do whatever you want with it. But you need to solve that problem, right? What does it look like when it's kind of blurry? You're seeing it from across the room. Does the image read? Is it working well? That's all we kind of need to do with the thumbnail. And I think it's worthwhile, again, looking at the idea of planning your images around text, right? Because this is often something that will make a difference if you have this kind of skill, the ability to work with text. I think if you're working on your own projects, this can make a massive, massive difference to the level of quality things have versus just kind of sticking a logo on something. It's a lot easier to make it feel as if, again, it was designed and it had sort of purpose here. So anyway, just a quick note on that kind of stuff. And, we kind of went from that to our construction drawing. And this is the, sort of next part of this general process. And this is all about structure. So you can see here that, this is a matter of taking out the core that we had in our thumbnail, where we're looking at our image from across the room. Does this work? And now we're saying yes, but it also needs to look good when we get closer. And the construction drawing, and a few of the things we did before that, where we were, sort of adding extra fidelity. Let's add more flowers. Let's add more grass. Let's see what's there, right? Let's think about what's going to be there in the background in the tree. You can see most of this stuff isn't irrelevant. People are going to be looking at the character, at the bird, at the flowers in the foreground, but thinking about what's going to be there and then constructing it and thinking about, how we plan for the next phase. That's what the construction drawing is all about. It is about anatomy, but it's also a matter of thinking about the visual fidelity, just how much stuff is in the image, and how rich and full it's going to feel, and thinking about that as a way to sort of take the thumbnail and move it to the next stage. And the construction drawing, again, remember, is where you really want to focus on improving your drawing. This is where you get to dial in and nail the drawing. So much of the reason that this, sort of has a natural pose that kind of feels good is because, we drew the arms underneath all the drapery. I got 5 shots at drawing the drapery. I did it, a whole bunch of times. I got to, sit there, zoom in, zoom out, look at the character's face, right? Tweak it, get it exactly right. Consider the size of a few things. That there's many things here that I probably redid, 5, 6 times. And there's other things where, we just kind of say, look, I don't need to pencil in every single flower. I'm going to get into the flow of it, but I do need to kind of say, look, let's have some of them pointing towards the camera. Let's have some of them pointing away from the camera. Let's get the sort of the balance right, and I'll just rough that in. You can also, do a lot more constructional work with some of these background elements if you need. Really construct them as cylinders, but basically whatever you need to get the job done. And a lot of what you do here is going to relate to the way you complete a creation loop. So as you create these things, right, as I create and as I finish this, now the next time I'm going to create an image, I'm going to say, oh, that's right, I didn't quite nail that, right? Maybe I didn't quite figure out how to, add that extra detail in the background. Let's add that to the construction phase. Let's add that to the sort of more detailed thumbnail, right? Let's think about, like, how can I get more fidelity in there? Maybe I should plan it. Maybe I should really have something there. Who knows? As we progress forward, anytime you notice that the drawing at the finish sucks or isn't up to scratch, isn't what you wanted it to be, that's where you can go back and kind of say, okay, next time I've got to nail that, right? I've got to get the bird right. It kind of looks silly. I didn't get the structure. I tried to wing it. Let's get some reference for that. Whatever it is. And you sort of progress and you learn. But this is the construction phase is where you do most of your drawing and you're learning about structure, anatomy, perspective, rendering, etc. If you were to add rendering to this, the construction phase is where you would kind of figure out where a lot of the shadows go, where a lot of the sort of rendering actually needs to happen by understanding and building out those forms. And then we have the finished lines, and this really is a matter of looking at the minutiae of how lines function, right? The battle is won at, one line next to another. If you're out by a few pixels, they sort of mush into each other. We get things looking kind of awkward. And remember that so much of line is symbolic, it's iconic, and we don't need to fill everything up. We don't need to finish everything. There's no ego involved. Whatever kind of works. One of the things I kind of learned so much by, trying to sort of study the way that mangaka work is, that they just really sit there and work the face and the eyes, and they put a lot of emphasis and effort into that. And I think it's worthwhile putting that much effort into that and really sort of looking at, how do I get each line in the face working really, really well? Don't think, oh, because I've constructed it properly, it's right, or this should be there. Really make sure that, it's right for you. That it's kind of working and it's giving you exactly the right kind of emotion. Because little millimeter differences in both, the way that I would, again, flat in the color of the teeth and the eyes and the specific way that the lines relate to that are drastically going to change the feeling that the face has, and the feeling of structure that it has. So the line work is a matter of really paying attention to the way that your lines work, right? Again, everyone's line work is going to be different. Some of it's clean, some of it's not. It's not always a matter of, drawing perfect lines or getting everything hyper clean. A lot of it is a matter of sort of looking at the emotion and just making sure you're getting your overlaps sort of sorted. And sort of finding your style within the line work. So and then obviously we, at the end we kind of have the finish, and this is what we've just been talking about. So much of this is a matter of understanding when to depart from your plan. Do you need to depart from it, right? If this is a professional job, it can be good to just stick to your original color thumbnail, right? If you've provided that, that's gold, because it means that you have something that works, and that if you hand that up, that's kind of what everyone's agreed on. But again, it's always possible to change things, work the warm and the cool, add extra contrast. And what you're always doing there is just looking at the simple basic image planning principle of what is your first, second, and third read. Where do you want people to look? What's important? And how do we kind of build an image around that? And as long as you keep that in mind, you won't go too far wrong. So anyway, I think I have kind of rambled incessantly about, this kind of process and why it's kind of important. This really is meant to be a tutorial that focuses on the color theory. But again, all these things interrelate. They all sort of interlock. And, you can kind of see that you need to understand the color theory in the beginning. That gives you a really good base. But you also need to understand the subtleties of it as you sort of progress, and understand that, a lot of color picking is a matter of, again, starting with a really simple sort of gray mush, and, then sort of picking and pulling things out from it, and understanding that, typically you want, some really sort of bold colors in there, but a lot of what is going to be in your image is just called the mud. It's just grays, gray versions of analogous colors or complementary colors, just stuff that is really going to sort of fade into the background and allow the main color to sort of come to the fore. And, this also is something where you have to find how much color you want to put in. We could dial the color up or down. It's going to affect the feeling, the emotion, the way people feel when they look at it. All of these things are completely valid. You can kind of use whatever colors you want. But if you stick with a simple plan, it means that when you're going into the coloring process, you've got a really good place to start. And then you kind of put all that in, and then it's very, very easy to say, oh yeah, a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that. And you have a good indication of where not to go, right? Like, let's not try and make it interesting by making the cloak red or making these flowers purple, right? We have a good idea of the way that we're going to make this work. We can modify the temperature a bit. We can modify the contrast. We can, make it a little bit more sort of impactful. But again, we know how we're going to do that because we have that original color plan. And working this way is a little bit longer, but it is more reliable. And, it's a lot more relaxing, right, over the long term. So when you're starting out, it may seem like there's a lot of steps here, but the more that you focus on the basics, just, doing the color plan, doing the thumbnail, doing the construction drawing, it means you know what's coming next. And as you work those into your creation loop, life becomes, a little bit easier. All right, so that's all we've got for part 4 of this tutorial series. And this is the final part. So thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate you hanging out with me to kind of, listen to me rambling throughout this long process. Let me know in the comments down below, or send me an email, tim@thedrawingcodex.com. Let me know what you thought of this tutorial series, whether you got any follow-up questions, whether you'd like to see more, sort of videos in this particular style. I thought it was was good to kind of break these up because, this is a fairly sort of long tutorial, but I still want to share this process with everyone, right? I still want to share how these things are actually done, but, breaking it up into some different sections allow me to expand on some of these things and feel a little bit less rushed because, again, it might be weird to have like a 6 or 7 hour long sort of, YouTube video. So again, let me know how this sort of worked for you, breaking it up. But yeah, other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.